Welcome to Biostasis Technologies' latest podcast. Our guest today is Peter Solakidis, if I pronounced that right this time, who is a real cryonics pioneer in the Southern Hemisphere. I had the pleasure of meeting Peter in person some years ago. Perhaps we'll talk a little bit about that when I was still running Alcor. So it's very interesting to know what's going on. There are a number of different new organizations starting recently, and yours is one of the most recent ones. But first of all, before we get into the details of the organization, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into this whole unusual topic.
Yeah. Well, I got interested in cryonics many, many years ago when I was young. I read Robert Ettinger's book, Prospect of Immortality. And I thought, gee, that sounds reasonable. That sounds quite logical. But I'm pretty young now. I need to follow a career, et cetera, et cetera. So what started happening was again, I thought it was logical. I followed my career, went ahead and thought by the time I retire, which is about 10 years ago, I said, by that time, I'm sure this will be so reasonable that there'll be cryonic centers just down the road. You just go down and you sign up on them because it sounded a good idea. I spent most of my career overseas. I worked for an oil company, mostly in planning, marketing, strategic project implementation, major project implementation, very large projects, and came back to Australia when I retired. Now it's closer to about 15 years ago or more. And of course, there was nothing like what I had thought. I hadn't really kept up with the progress through all that time while I was working. And then, based on that, I decided a few people got together and we decided that, look, Australia can get cryonics. We can do cryonics in Australia. We can send to the overseas organisations, all very good organisations, but there were a lot of logistics problems. So we got together and there was a lot of talk, a lot of people getting together, a lot of things. And finally, I sort of maybe was one of the full forces behind it because of my background in project implementation and those things. I said, let's do it. So we decided to do it and build a facility here and a framework around that facility. That's the short picture. I can go into it forever, but that's the short picture.
How long between reading Ettinger's book and thinking seriously, yes, I want to do this, and starting on the organization work?
When was it? 72 versus 2010.
Oh,
So
1972, you read it. Okay.
a
Wow.
long time. That was
Yeah.
when I really worked. I was working. I really never thought about this while I was working. So
Mm.
when I retired, though, it became a bigger thing, and also it gave me something to do when I retired. So
Mm. Now, the way you started the organization, as I understand it, is a little different than how most other organizations started. In that, I believe you have a number of investors who have a special status in the organization, and they provided the initial capital to make this work, rather than it being, a very slow growth from basically nothing. Is that right?
yeah, that's very true. And even though we call them investors, we're a non-profit organization. Now we're not a tax deductible non-profit, but we're still a non-profit
Mm-hmm.
organisation under Australian law. So strictly, they're not investors; they're
All right.
members. But basically, what we did was we said we needed X number of members at 50,000 Australian dollars each to come in. Now, those members would get a free suspension for coming in at that amount. And what we did was we said we could actually start operations when we had something like about 12 to 14. I had thought, I'm always very lowballing or forecasting. I had thought we'd get 18. I thought that was great. In the end, we got
Mm.
35.
That's
So
amazing.
we got
Yeah, it's really
35,
surprising.
paying between 50 and 70,000
Mm-hmm.
because we increased the amount. This is Australian dollars. And that was the way we started. It's a non-profit. It's membership. Those members get free suspension. After we operated, however, we moved into the more standard model. The
Mm-hmm.
standard model is to start bringing in, you'd call them clients, customers who take out a life insurance policy and all the rest. And we started at about the beginning of this year. We
Mm-hmm.
started taking that sort of group in. The membership has stopped. We now start that thing, and that cost them 150,000 Australian dollars, but that's normally paid through life insurance. We're now at the more
Mm-hmm.
standard way in which you would normal Alcor and CI and all the rest operate.
All right.
So, and I'm jumping a bit, but we've now got about, what is it, about 30 of that new group.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Additional to the 35 we had of members, we've got another 30 starting early this year with life insurance policies, et cetera, et cetera.
And presumably also membership dues, not just the cryopreservation fee.
We pay what we call subscription
Subscription.
at the
Okay.
beginning. They have to be a subscriber for 5 years before they can become a member. Uh,
Oh.
and one of the reasons for that, and I delved very quickly into it, is that we're a small organization and we didn't want to be inundated with members that took control of the organization straight away. I mean, if you're paying 350 Australian dollars a year, you could have 50 people could join up, 20 people could join up and take complete control, all our finances, and not have an interest in
Oh,
cryonics.
so members are actually voting members then, not just sort of in the
Members
members
are
in name.
voting members,
Okay.
yes, and that's the 35 initial
Mm.
founding members. The subscribers come on now, and in 5 years, they have the opportunity to become a member. But in
Mm.
that 5 years, they can't do things very quickly, and we get a chance to vet them, find out who they are. They're really interested in cryonics, etc., etc., and then they become members in 5, and they can vote in 5 years after
Yeah.
5 years of
Okay.
being.
Yeah, that's very sensible because it's you can imagine if someone hostile, they just have
Yes,
to get a few of their friends together and they can take over the organization.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's right, and that's
Yeah.
worried us at the very beginning. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's that structure of that part of the organization, the
Hmm.
membership. We call them subscribers. They're not yet voting. The
Okay.
people who came in after we started, we opened our doors, which was March 1 this year.
Right. I like that you call them subscribers because, other organizations have members and it's always confusing as to what does
Mm.
that mean because, some members are cryopreservation members, some are not.
Yeah.
They're just kind of really subscribers. And then
Well,
there are people who some organizations just have pets but aren't signed up themselves and they get called members. So I like that you differentiate that with subscribers.
we had to, because in Australia, a member automatically, if you call somebody a member, they have voting rights. Once you call them
Mm.
a member, they have voting rights. So what
Oh,
we
okay.
did was we called them subscribers. The founding members are members, of course, but the subscribers have to come in as being members later
Mm.
on. It's just
Oh,
the legal requirement for the sort of organisation that we've set up in Australia.
okay. That's interesting. That's different than the US. You can call people members even if they're not voting members. And, both voting and non-members are very common in different nonprofits.
That's possible, but the organisation that we're under sort of
Mm.
a Australian government organisation, it's a limited by guarantee non-profit
Mhm.
organisation. If the name is a member, they have voting rights
Right.
in the
Yeah,
organisation.
it's a little different. Okay. Before you started Southern Cryonics, did you visit other cryonics organizations in America or
Yes,
other places? And
absolutely.
if so, what did you learn from that, if anything?
I learnt a lot. In fact, I visited obviously Alcor, where you were heading up Alcor at the time. I visited Cryonics Institute, and also I visited the UK organisation, which was more SST type organisation
Hmm.
at that time. And I've forgotten the name of the gentleman who very kindly
Tim
showed me around.
Gibson. Probably
Yeah,
Tim
that's it,
Gibson. Yeah.
the ambulance and all these,
Yeah.
really helpful. But I learnt a lot. I happened to luck in on the right times on those organizations. I think when I visited Alcor, you had a an arrival of a dewar, and you had a neuro suspension
Yeah.
exactly like
It's
that.
very good timing.
When I visited CI, they had uh, they had a like a whole lot of students were visiting through CI to look around and to inform them what was going on. So I had a good introduction as to how they dealt with the public, how they
Mm.
did all that, and we got a lot of work done on the SST part because, as you know, Dennis, even though he's CI, he's very interested in SST. So he gave me a lot of information about the SST part of the
Hmm.
organisation. And of course, in the UK, I learnt a lot about how their ambulance works. It's not for us, but I learnt something else which was critical, that they could take a patient from the UK to the US in 10 hours. They would have the patient would stay suspended. Well, at least they were at dry ice temperatures, but they'd stay at dry ice temperatures.
Hmm.
One of our problems was that we could take to the US would take something like 25, 26 hours if there wasn't delays, and
Hmm.
we had real problems with that. So what we learned from them was to take to Hawaii first and then to the US, so we could do
Mm.
2 10-hour jumps, and we could do those jumps and
Right.
actually be able to handle, if we have people in Australia who are from Alcor or
Hmm.
CI, we could actually do the SST for them if requested by those organisations, not for the
Yeah.
patient themselves, but those organisations would have to request it of us.
Yeah, that
I'm
is a
giving you,
long, long way to go, certainly.
yeah,
I
there's a
know, I
lot.
know, I don't know how many cases there have been from Australia. I know there's been at least a couple of Alcor, maybe more, and CI's probably had some
Yeah, a
before
couple,
Southern
but the
Cryonics
last
started.
one was about 2005. I'm going to guess a number around 2005. So it's a long
Mm.
time since the last one from
Yeah.
Australia.
Yeah, the difficulty of transporting over long distances is a real challenge because if you have a neuro patient, if you do neuroseparation locally, that makes it a lot easier. You can actually keep a
Yeah,
neuro
yeah,
patient. I
yeah.
know that at Alcor we tested a box that keeps the temperature at dry ice for about 6 days, so that's ample
Yes,
time. But for a whole
yes,
body
yeah,
patient, that can be a challenge with the airlines to allow enough dry ice on them. A lot of
yeah.
them obviously give trouble with that.
Although Emil tells me that he has a box that can do the whole patient almost over a week. And he has some
Hmm.
design, and I said, could you send it to us because it might be interesting to us? Yeah, if we have.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing we found with those is definitely to test them locally before you use them because it's interesting. You can have a design that can work, but if you don't put
Yeah,
it together right, then it can be very
exactly.
different. So,
No,
yeah,
it's exactly right. We've sort of learnt that the hard way.
yeah.
A lot of things we've learnt the hard way.
Another lesson actually is do not trust funeral directors to do that properly. So if you want them to do the
Yeah,
shipping, do
yeah,
not let them do the shipping unless you have someone there to watch them because they will
yeah.
tell you they're going to do what they want. They may tell you yes. If you say, well, don't ship them till you send me photos and video. They'll send them and not do the photos and video. So you cannot
Yeah.
no matter how friendly they are, do not believe them. Always have eyes on them
No,
directly.
and we work very closely with them. In fact, we're lucky that we have one that we can talk to very frankly, relate to, and actually do a lot with them. And they're almost part of our family in a sense. They've been with us for a long time.
Hmm.
Even before we got started, we were sort of close to them because they helped us out. They actually held meetings in their
Hmm.
facility to give us. So
Yeah, that's
they're not
great.
really cryonics related, but they're very helpful to what we're
Hmm.
doing. And we've got a good relationship with them. There's one in Sydney that we have that. We don't have the
Hmm.
same relationship all around Australia.
And they're used to doing international shipping.
Yes, as it
Okay, so
happens, they are, but not for chronics, but they're
right.
used to doing funeral requirements
Hmm.
internationally. They're a sort of an Italian background company, and there's a lot of people who passed away here that wanted to be buried back in Italy.
Hmm.
And of course, because Australia has a very high population of people from Italy, Greece, and those sorts of backgrounds who are in that age bracket, and they were very good. In fact, they can do the all the international paperwork almost online. They have it all online to do it very quickly if we
That's good.
needed to do it.
Hmm. Very good. Now, cryonics, as you know, consists of several kind of major chunks. The revival part's a long way in the future, but in the present, you've got the membership issue, you've got doing standby stabilization transport, and you've got long-term storage. And those are
Yeah,
each quite different with different
yeah.
requirements. So they don't necessarily belong under one roof. So how is Southern Cryonics or other organizations structured to deal with that?
Well, we decided, and there was some risk reasons for this, and there were some reasons that just normal operational reasons within our own organisation. Southern Chronics itself is actually the facility and the long term storage, basically the preparation for long term storage and the long term storage itself, like the cooling down and then putting into long term storage. That's Southern Chronics. We have another organisation called CryoPath, which is to do with the SST. And what happens with CryoPath is that, as I said, CryoPath is a pay-as-you-go organization. So if you join Southern Cryonics, you don't have the SST. We're very close to the CI, the Cryonics Institute model, where we basically only do at Southern Cryonics the storage. Southern CryoPath does the SST. CryoPath outsources this SST to uh, to a company called Australian Blood Management. They are not a cryonics organization, but they handle perfusions and heart type, evaluate heart
Mm-hmm.
type, what do you call them, heart lung machine type, ECMO type things for hospitals, for
Mm-hmm.
smaller hospitals and those. They're an outside organization. They have doctors, perfusionists. For them, a perfusionist is slightly different to what we term a perfusionist. Perfusionist for them is somebody who works a heart lung type machine or an ECMO machine. That's what is in the
Mm-hmm.
normal term. So
Mm-hmm.
they have that organization, and we outsource the actual SST to them, although we are there. CryoPath is there as well. Now, because there's not that many of us in Australia, the organisation of CryoPath and Southern Cryonics is almost almost the same people at the moment. There are a few differences, but it's
Mm-hmm.
almost the same people. We're hoping in the future, as we get bigger, we trend apart. So we have Southern Cryonics, we have CryoPath who handles the SST, and we have two other organisations smaller. We have CryoPrime, which handles things like trusts, long-term trusts, And then we have another organization, Cryonic Services. Say somebody comes to us and says, look, we're not interested in joining Southern Cryonics. We want to join Alcor. Well, Cryonic Services Australia will link them on with Alcor, help them with the paperwork, help them with what's required in Australia to actually join Alcor or CI. In fact, Cryonic Services Australia, I think, had 3 or 4 people have joined Alcor and another 2 people, Cryonics Institute, using their services.
So it's really a co-opetition model there. You're not necessarily this way is the only way.
Yeah. We're saying if somebody comes to us and says they really want to join Alcor or CI, that's their right. We help them do it through this other organization. CryoPath, as I mentioned, will also do the SST if requested by Alcor or by CI. If CI says to us, look, we have a patient who's just told us in Australia, could you get to the hospital bed? Could you do this and this and do the transport overseas? CryoPath will, based on a mutual agreement as to what it's going to cost, we'll do that. And again, CryoPath is on a pay-as-you-go basis. CryoPath doesn't have any funding itself. If we have to catch an aeroplane in CryoPath to go to the patient, then that patient had better had prepaid us. And a lot of people, what they do is they have funds with CryoPath so that we can use those funds in case of emergency. On top of that, if you are with Southern Cryonics and you take out your life insurance policy, you can take an extra life insurance policy, an extra amount, of which then Southern Cryonics will go to CryoPath and say, we have the money from the insurance. Can you guys get going? And when I say you guys, it's almost the same people, but in future it will be different and they can do it that way.
So doing it by insurance makes it a lot more affordable. If you have to just pay that chunk of cash, it's quite a bit.
Very affordable. There are some strange things in Australian life insurance, but basically, if you're about 40 years old, 45 years old, to get coverage, it's something like about Australian dollars, so multiplied by about 0.65 for US, but it's something like about 500, that'd be about 350 US dollars a year to get coverage for that, say 400 US dollars a year.
Like a term policy?
Well, yes and no.
Yes and no. Okay, different there.
Well, I say that because Australia has a real problem in that area. A term, when you say term, let me make sure I understand what do you mean by term? Just to make sure I'm
term policies are very common here. I'm really I'm pretty much against them, except for young people with low incomes. I think they can make sense. Basically, a term policy is usually a 20 or 30-year term. There are other versions. And that means if you die within that period of time, they will pay out. But if you die a day after that, you'll get no payment whatsoever. So they're a lot less expensive, and they pay out, I think, like 3% of the time they pay out. So it's a good business. So that's different than a universal life or a whole life policy.
Well, in Australia, when I say term, they're yearly policies. In a sense, I don't know whether it's term, but basically you take out a life insurance policy in Australia, and as long as you keep paying the premium, you're insured. So it almost goes year by year. I don't know whether you'd call it term because there's no real term. As long as you keep paying the premium, you're insured.
That's kind of like a universal life policy, I guess. At least the kind of universal life that doesn't build a cash value. Some of them actually build cash values, then they become a bit more like whole life policies, which tend to be more expensive.
I don't think builds the cash value, but it could. I'm not 100% sure of how it works. The problem in Australia is that in the US, and I have a US policy, in the US you can get a life insurance policy that says I pay a constant amount every year till I'm 105, for example. I don't know whether it's a term or whatever you'd call it, but I'm 105 years old, and it's a flat amount. In Australia, you cannot get one that is flat past about age 70. So what happens is you go out and you say, oh, good, this isn't bad. I've got this policy for $1,000 a year or whatever it is. Goes to age 70. At age 70, no matter where you are, it escalates. It escalates, moves into the other types of policies, which you can't get in Australia the same as you can get in the US. And that is a problem because most people who are passing away, of course, after the age 70. So we're trying to think of ways in which to help them. And it becomes very expensive, as you would imagine. Imagine going at 75, 78, 80 years old and trying to get a life insurance policy. It's almost the cost of the policy. But
Yeah.
anyway, I'm digressing into areas that are very much local areas rather than areas that are probably more interesting for a more global audience.
One way you can get a policy at any age is basically by paying a single premium, but of course that makes it just about as difficult as paying cash. Then, so it's not very
Yeah, but
appealing.
even with single premium in Australia, you wouldn't be able to get it past the
Yeah,
age of 70 because you could, but the single premium might be for a $200,000 policy, $150,000. No
yeah,
problem. You
yeah.
know,
Doesn't help much at that point.
maybe they could do that. Maybe, yeah, or maybe more than that if they allow for that. But anyway, Australia single premium are not that widely used. But anyway,
Are
let's.
you, are you able to? Are members able to get a U.S. insurance policy and use that, or is that do they have to go to
Yes
the
and
U.S. to get
no.
a blood test or something?
Yes and no. Unfortunately, up to pre-COVID times, you could do that using our friend. Should remember his name,
Rudy?
Rudy. Rudy.
Yeah.
Prior to COVID times, U.S.
Mm,
companies, as long as you were in the U.S. for some reason, you could have been there for vacation for a week. If you were in there for vacation for a week, you could get a U.S. policy. But they stopped that because I had sent people over and
mm,
to get a policy. I actually got mine when I lived in the US for 4 years, and I got my US policy when I lived in the US. But
mm.
it used to be able to. You can't even do it for UK. No countries now allow you
Hmm.
to get that sort of policy, whereas it
That's
used to be
strange.
possible. Yeah, it used to be possible. Something to do with, I think it was they changed around COVID times. Around COVID times, it changed.
Yeah, a lot of things got worse around
Yeah, yeah,
COVID times.
yeah, yeah,
It must
yeah.
be some kind of weird regulation because it
Before
seems
that,
like it'd be interesting. The companies they would be interested in selling their policies, so they must be being stopped
oh
by
yeah, I
regulations.
don't know. Yeah. Unfortunately, it stopped, and Rudy used to have a whole page for international people on his
Mm,
website. If you wanted to come in, you would just fill out this page, but you had to be in the US. But all you had to
mm.
do was go to Hawaii, for example, for a couple of weeks vacation, and you could get a life insurance policy in those
Right.
days. Mm.
Do you accept any other form of funding? Like, for instance, Alcor will take trust funds. Um, I had also developed an alternative funding policy for people who are older, who had less income, but actually have assets, where you could, with a big discount for risk, you could use like a house as collateral or something like that. Hasn't been much used. Do you offer anything like that right now?
We offer it. What we do is we offer it, but it's there's a few. Obviously, there's the easy one, pre-funding. I mean, if somebody were to
Mm,
prepay the amount,
right.
that's the easy one. The other one is things like reverse mortgages, but nobody's taken it that one. The pre-funding has been taken up. The reverse mortgage, no. And the third one is payment from the estate. We do offer that, but what we do is we offer it at a much higher subscription rate when somebody wants that one. And the reason why we offer the higher subscription rate is because sort of to cover our risk.
Mm,
Uh, Now, there is another section to it which most cryonics organizations don't like, which nobody's taken this up at the moment. But the last aspect of that agreement is that if somebody doesn't pay from the estate in 1 year, they lose their suspension. So that means they are respectfully buried at that
mm.
stage. So that's
Yeah,
the issue with that one.
a
That's
state's
how
very
that works.
Yeah, a state's very difficult, but it is a little bit like what I was saying with the alternative funding scheme, where we would take real estate, for instance, but we would discount it by 50%. So if you say you have a property worth 500,000, we only count half of that because of the risk that
Exactly. Yeah.
every
No,
second or third time we get nothing. So
no,
that's hard to do, of course, with very small numbers because it doesn't average out very well. But as you
yeah.
get numbers
And
grow, it gets a little
it's got
better.
hard to do with estates in the sense that they can be contested and they can
Hmm.
stay
Yeah,
even an
for
uncontested
years.
estate
Yeah.
stays 6 months in Australia. It takes about to get an uncontested estate
Mm,
finalised. So if somebody were to contest it, we can't hold that person for years and years, and then find out we lost the money anyway because we get
right.
nothing because it's completely contested. So anyway,
You can try and persuade people to, if you have the same system, I presume you have something like this, to set up a family trust. Me and Natasha have done that, so it doesn't have to go through probate. And when the second of us goes, it will go into a fund basically to be paid back to us if we get revived, and that
yes,
avoids probate. But of course, that takes some work to do. So some people aren't going to
yeah,
want to do the extra work.
yeah, yeah, and yeah, probate. Yeah, no, you could do that. You're right. But let me just think. A lot of people don't want exactly what you just said because we have a trust that they can join onto. This
Mm.
is separate trust, not an Alcor type trust. What do you call it? where you keep money aside that people paid for the future or whatever it is to pay
Asset
for their
preservation
yearly
trust, or yeah.
reservation trust. It's not that, but we do have separate where people can take out an individual trust,
Mm,
and we have three types. But the main one is an individual trust where people
mm,
can take out a trust. We have a trust deed. It costs a lot of money to set up that trust deed because the rules against perpetuities, all these things are very difficult to overcome in Australia. So it cost a lot of money. I think we paid Australian
mm.
dollars $70,000 to $80,000 to get that
Oof.
trust
Wow.
deed. So if somebody wanted it, we sell it to them for $8,000. Three people have taken it
Mm,
so far, and then they have to do solicitors' fees to tailor it for their own. But that's a separate trust, and they can do what you say with that trust too. They can put the funds in the trust, and it can
mhm.
pay for everything as you go along.
What is the rule against perpetuities in Australia? Because in the US, that used to be a big problem a few decades ago, but now most states have extended it to several hundred years, 500 years, or no limit at all. How is it over there?
In the US, it's been extended mainly for tax reasons, so you can jump a generation in being able to keep estates going. But if you look at it deeply in the US, which I did look at, and I can't remember the answer now, it doesn't work that well for cryonics. But it's good enough, I guess, but it doesn't work that well. In Australia, the rule in almost every state is that it's the old rule that you can keep an estate only 80 years after the death, around 80 years, 80, 100 years after your death. So you can keep things in trust 80 to 100 years after your death. After that time, the trust has to pay out at
Mm,
that stage. If not, it's an illegal trust. There is one state that has stopped that rule against perpetuities. In better words, you can keep it for any number of years in that state, and that's where our deed is set in that state. But it's
mm,
also difficult to transfer assets to that state because you imagine
mm,
being in a state where there's a rule for a rule the rule against perpetuities is in place. If
mm.
you leave your estate to the other one, it's illegal. It's an illegal trust, and therefore that trust can be challenged in this state. So it's all complex.
They don't
That's
want to
why
lose their tax revenue, right? Yeah.
well, there's a
Uh,
lot of issues with it. That's why it costs so much money with high level trust lawyers working
mm,
this thing for a long time. But it is a problem in Australia and even the US. Even though you think, I remember looking at it once because we tried to get the US model, and there were problems for cryonics in that US model because it was designed for a different reason. The
mm.
rule has been given up, but for a different reason than the cryonics reason. But then again, I'm not the expert in the US, so I'll let people check that out.
80 years after death is kind of a interesting time because that's kind of in the time frame where many of us think that might be plausible, but it could easily be
No,
longer than that because the optimists are expecting this in the next 20 years in the singularity, but I'm not counting on that. So I think
no.
80 years after death, that's it might be
Yeah,
good enough.
it's right at the worst time. It's right. My thinking, by the way, is 250 years,
Mm,
but I don't know. I mean, zero people actually know the answer, even if
that's
it's
right.
possible. Sorry, if it's possible, I'm thinking
Hmm.
250 years. So nobody really knows for sure.
No, no. Anybody who says they know for sure, immediately, I don't want to believe
Yeah,
them.
it's
There's
impossible to know.
too many unknowns.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Now, you said that you have CryoPath to provide SST services, but you don't require that members have SST. Do you encourage that? Are you kind of neutral about it? Because obviously, if you don't have SST, you're likely to get a poorer preservation. So, what is your kind of official stance on that?
Well, our official status is we encourage our members to have SST and we encourage them to do something with CryoPath because but it's not cheap method of doing it. If some member says, I'm not going to do it that way, I want a straight freeze and I'm going to use my uh, funeral home to give me a straight freeze, then we'll work on that basis if that's how they want to do it. The only criteria though is Southern Cryonics only accepts a patient when they're at the facility itself. So if you ring me up and you've got no SST and you're in some other state, I'll say,
Mm,
fine, that patient, perhaps you're representing a patient, you have to get that patient to us. And therefore, that's why we're pushing so hard to have our members have something with this CryoPath organization or their own arrangements themselves. I
mm,
mean, some people are fairly well off, so I'm not that worried. They can say no problem. They can transfer into our bank account $50,000-$60,000, which is the amount that we need, and we can have it straight away and start moving on that basis. Other people are not, and it's not that easy to do. But that's why we suggest they get something organised, and that's for the members. Don't forget the subscribers who joined afterwards. Their life insurance policy does include a segment for that. The insurance goes to Southern Cryonics. In fact, what happens is Southern Cryonics then hires CryoPath, and CryoPath is a customer of Southern Cryonics. And then when Southern Cryonics gets the life insurance fund, it pays. When Southern Cryonics gets the funds, it pays CryoPath. Mm-hmm. That's how, for example, if we were doing a case for CryoPath, if we were doing an Alcor case, let's say Alcor said, look, you guys, it'll take us 5 days to get there. Can you be at the hospital bed, CryoPath? Can you do it? And we'll take it over at X stage, perhaps at the funeral attendance stage. What they would do is we would say, fine, but you, Alcor, we are clients of Alcor. So if to get paid, this is what our costing's roughly going to be like. We're going to be looking for you to pay us at the end of that time period. We're not dealing with the customer or the patient or anything. We are a client of Alcor or CI in those cases. So, and in the other case with the life insurance, we're the client of Southern Cryonics in that life insurance case.
And it doesn't, with life insurance, it really doesn't cost much more to cover the SST, because there's kind of a minimum amount for life insurance below which they won't even bother issuing it. So it's probably like 100,000. So if you go from there to 100, it doesn't double if you go to 200,000. So adding SST makes it
is very, very easy to cover through life insurance. The people who are in a problem is those original founding members who have paid the $50,000 for the free suspension, but they don't have SST in that. So what they have to do is cover themselves separately, either by putting funds with with CryoPath, or taking out a small life insurance policy, or somehow covering those funds. And a lot of people say, I can write a check at the time, or not a check, but transfer funds at the time.
Well, they could already have life insurance for the family and then just take a certain part of that.
They could do that. The only thing is, though, that here's the bit I stress to everybody: CryoPath doesn't move till it has funds. We can't even get a taxi and get to your location. So if you say my father's passed away, I need you to be there. I had a case very recently, and it was a false alarm, but as it happens, it proved a point. It was a gentleman who was a founding member right from the beginning. And I got a call from, and we'd sent many times, you better cover yourself with CryoPath to everybody. You better cover yourself. We don't have funds. And I got a call. I'm in the hospital. I'm going to have something very serious happen. I might be passing away. I need you to get over here. And this is Perth, right over the other side of Australia. It's a New York to LA type distance, if you talk about that sort of distance. You need to get over here, and we need to. I said, look, I won't mention names. I said, we just don't have the funds to do that. As I told you. He says, I'll organise something. I'll do something. I said, all right. When you organise the funds, we can actually get the aeroplanes and all the rest. But don't forget, sometimes just to transfer money through a bank account takes a couple of days to do that.
Yeah.
So we don't move till that's CryoPath. So we're recommending everybody either have the funds with CryoPath or have some method to pay very quickly if you need.
Bitcoin, you can do within a few seconds or a few minutes.
Some method that instantaneously gets us the money so we can actually buy an aeroplane ticket to go. And Australian Blood Management, who we subcontract or we outsource this to, they have significant charges too. They got doctors, they got perfusionists, all the rest. We have to fly them all over as well to the location. So they're not cheap, as you would guess.
Yeah, there's a bit of a tension, not really a contradiction, but a tension here in that. On the one hand, I think most of us want to do scientific cryonics. We want to preserve people in as good condition as possible. But on the other hand, we know there are people who just can't afford that. They can only afford, not having SST, maybe only afford a straight freeze. So what do you do there? And there's, some people say we should only accept people under good conditions, and others say no, we should accept people under any conditions that might possibly be salvageable in the future.
Yeah.
And I tend to be an advocate of the former, as long as we clearly distinguish between the cases that are actually more scientifically justified by the evidence we have so far versus basically an act of desperation, which might or might not work. But I think it's better that they do have that choice than not, as long as we're clear about the difference.
No, I agree. I agree with that. No, I think we're generally in alignment with that. We will, we're very much for the idea that we want people to be suspended. We want them to be suspended in the best way possible. But we understand there's a range. We have people who say, "I want a straight freeze." I prefer, for example,
a few people who have that odd view. Yes.
Well, I prefer the freezing rather than the shrinkage, for example. That's there's a whole lot of a group in that category too. So that's their choice. I mean, I'm not going to argue with them because I don't know. They could be right 250 years. I could say, wow, I wish I had the straight freeze if I'm around at that time. So I don't know.
I think in a few years that'll be out.
Yeah, go on.
They'll be outdated in a few years because I think there'll be ways. I mean, this is already being researched now, and with the Brain Preservation Prize, they already looked into using SDS to stop brain shrinkage. So I think soon the brain shrinkage may be a thing of the past, hopefully. So that won't be the trade-off anymore.
Yeah, it may be, and I think using it. The only problem with that approach, as of now, is that it makes it difficult. Uploading is, brain uploading is still very possible using that approach. But as of now, the thinking is not very good for actually reviving a brain that's been treated.
I think we're talking about two different things here, because it's probably my fault for mentioning the Brain Preservation Prize, because that kind of mixes a couple of different things. So you're talking about the aldehyde fixation. I'm actually talking about a different substance with SDS, which is to stop brain shrinkage, basically. Without it's completely unrelated. So you could stop the brain shrinkage while doing standard cryopreservation. So you can combine it with aldehyde stabilized, but it's a separate thing.
Or something in the brain, or something to open the blood-brain barrier, or something. I'm not completely with it. If it's a possible method, I really think
it's still in research. Yeah, it's too soon to apply it just yet, but it's I think pretty close.
I know there's one where there's some detergent, Emil from.
That's it. Yeah, SDS is cool. I forget what that stands for.
You put it in there and it opens the blood-brain barrier and prevents or minimizes the shrinkage which goes on. But yes, that you're right. That would solve both problems. Yes.
Yeah. Now in Australia, you have kind of well, maybe not completely unique. It's a little bit like the US in a way, because we have certain population centers that could be quite far apart. But it's a bit of an extreme in Australia, because you have 3 major population centers? Is that reasonable to say, that are quite far apart? So how does CryoPath manage that? Do they have people in each area, or fast transport?
We probably have 1, 2. There's 3, and then there's 4 and 5, let's say. But they're capital city centers. Australia is actually centered in about 5 capital cities. Now, as it happens, Melbourne and Sydney, they're the 2 major population centres, and Holbrook, which is halfway between those 2, is midway between the 2. And if you cover the population there, we're talking about 50% of Australia's population is roughly in that area. With that, we can get to Melbourne and do the suspension in Melbourne within an hour on a flight. There's a lot of flights that fly Sydney to Melbourne. And we can get to the other major area, which is in north, which is in Brisbane, which is in Queensland, also in an hour. So we can cover most within, now, it's not obviously it's in the middle of the night. We're not going to be there in an hour or something, but within reasonable times, we can be at these population centres. And what we have is, we have in each of them what we call satellite funeral directors that we work with, but they're not our prime funeral director. So what we can do is we can go there with our equipment and with the solutions to these 2 places. We can then do the perfusion, all the standby, etc., right up to the perfusion stage, put the patient in dry ice, and then transport through road transport, because in dry ice we've got a little bit more time to do things, and bring them back to the facility through those. Western Australia, Perth, which is right over the other end, this New York to LA distance, is a problem. If we had to be there, it's at least 2 or 3 days to organise things, and that's a problem. And we have actually quite a few in that area, but that is a problem. But luckily, even though they're spread, our population is very much in this southeast
Mm.
uh, part of Australia. So it's not perfect, but it's the best we can do. We're
Yeah.
actually taking all the perfusion, everything to the patient, rather than bringing them in and then doing all that work.
Yeah. I think it's probably a good practice for when we move to Mars, because
Yeah,
presumably on Mars we'll have just like a few settlements that may be a very long distance apart, very
yeah,
different than Europe, of course, where it's all very close together and you can drive
right,
across several
yeah.
countries in a short
And,
period of time.
and not only that, but it's close, but they have large populations in each area. So you can afford to
Mm.
have, for example, you could afford to put an ambulance in a particular area because you've got a large population. We couldn't afford to do that. We're talking, and we might have 10, say 10 people in Sydney, 10 people in Victoria, maybe 5 people here, 6 people here. So it's just small numbers of people that we have. And even in the future, we're not going to have thousands of people in each of these areas. It's probably
No,
going
we
to be,
hope so. Hope so
well, it'd be
eventually,
great
but
if it did, but our whole planning is based on the idea that we don't have that many
right.
people. We have to base it on that because
Yes,
if
yes.
it booms, fine, but we upside, but we're on the real
Right.
ground level as to what we're doing.
We keep expecting that it's going to take off, but we've been
Yeah.
expecting that for decades now, so you
Well,
can't
I
guarantee that.
expected in 1972 or whatever it was, I expected
Mm.
it to take off, and I thought by the time I'm now, I think I told you I expected it to be everywhere. You just
Mm.
sign on, log on to something, and just get into some cryonics facility as a matter of course, rather than going to a hospital. You almost go
Yeah.
into a cryonics facility, but it's not the way it is. Yeah, unfortunately.
No. Maybe won't be for decades. I know. Hopefully it'll change, but
Agreed.
we don't
So
know.
we have to base it on the idea. My planning, my background is planning again.
Mm.
I always, for chronics especially, I base it on a very, very base case. So there's a lot of upside to my plans. As you saw from my number of members, I thought 18 and we ended up with 35.
Which is actually
So
very impressive, given the population of Australia for
yeah,
this topic. It's actually very impressive.
there was a lot of pent up demand in Australia.
Yeah.
I think we still have some of that pent up demand, but we're forecasting about 10 subscribers a year, and we forecast about one suspension a year for the next 20 to 25 years. It
Hmm.
may grow after that, but that's because a lot of our subscribers are younger people, so they'll probably be suspensions later on in
Yeah.
time.
I wonder if, you said there was pent up demand. I wonder where that came from. I know Thomas Donaldson, who used to be a very prominent
Yeah.
member of Alcor, was born in Australia, lived there for a long time. And I wonder if he had some influence. I don't know.
It may have been. There has been a very, I mean, there has been a cryonics community in Australia even before I came. It was headed by somebody. Thomas Donaldson was there, but taken over mainly by a gentleman called Phil Rhodes, which is
Hmm.
part of our organisation in a sense at the moment. He's actually the main person who looks after our facility, Phil Rhodes. And he also heads up the Cryonics Association of Australasia. And they've always been around, and there
Mm.
was always some interest in cryonics in Australia, but we have an added benefit is Australia's fairly, I guess, they're fairly open to things like cryonics. It's not, we've had, and I know you'll talk about the media, but our media response has been phenomenal. Uh, we've, I say this and I probably should bite my tongue, but we've never had a negative media reaction to what we're doing. Everything has been from positive to, let's say, semi-indifferent, but never at
Mm.
the negative end, but at least being on the positive end. I've done a lot of, last year with our first patient, I did a lot of media interviews and that, and it was always fairly positive. Australia has open mind. The population is not really very religious. It's got a high level of not being very religious.
Mm.
And I think the attitude in Australia, and it was pointed out to me once, which was Australia's great, but not for me. That's why you'll have no resistance to cryonics, but it's not like we'll have a gigantic membership.
Mm.
Most of the people think cryonics is great, but not for me. Somebody else, I would never stop anybody else from doing it. And that's
Yeah.
the general attitude in Australia. So,
Well, that's good. It's probably partly a cultural thing. I think it's also partly because media coverage has really changed over the years. I
yeah,
remember
yeah.
back in the 90s or 80s, 90s, it was pretty hostile and unfriendly, but that
Yes.
gradually changed. I know, because I spent 10, 12 years doing media for Alcor, and
Mhm.
we very rarely got a really bad story. There was only a
Yeah.
couple of bad ones. And sometimes, they'll quote someone who's a bit a bit rude about it, but then they'll balance that with positive quotes. So it's definitely improved over time, and it should further as we see more scientific results coming out, and it becomes a more familiar idea. No longer seems like science fiction. I mean, we can think back 30 years to the 90s when AI was science fiction and space had stopped working, and
Oh, yes,
nanotechnology was a fantasy. All these things that are now actually happening, cloning, decoding the genome, all these science fictional things that are now reality.
absolutely.
So
Yeah,
people think about that, and go, well, maybe this isn't really crazy after all.
yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, nobody in cryonics says it's a sure thing. I always keep saying there are no guarantees, but we're saying it's a possibility and it's better than the alternative, of which I don't even have to state to
Yeah.
people who are interested in cryonics. I think one interesting thing is, and this is the scientific viewpoint that's changed, and there were two examples of which one comes to mind. I was interviewed with an in-depth interview for a newspaper. And it was very good interview. The guy was really great. We did a good interview. He says, of course, Peter, I have to now go and also talk to a scientific person. And they're going to say that this is probably won't work, etc. I said, that's good. I want it. I prefer you to talk to that because it makes it look like we are a science too. We're not a religion. But
Yeah.
I said, when you ask them a question, most scientists, because my background is science, will think in terms of the next 10 or 20 years. So if you say to a scientist, you don't put a time frame. Is cryonics possible? No way, because they're thinking 10 or 20 years. I said,
Right.
if the person answers, I said, ask them whether they think what would happen in 200 years, whether it's possible.
Mm.
Okay. When you ask the question. So I saw the article then, and he'd ask a scientist, and he'd ask the scientist, what do you think? No, not possible. It's the standard answer because of this. And then he said, do you really think it's not possible in 200 years? And the scientist answers, well, never say never. And the answer changed based on the time period because obviously no scientist is going to say something is impossible in 200 years' time. So
Well, some will, because they'll say the brain has been turned to mush, which is ludicrous if they actually know what they're talking about. But so some will say that, but yeah, it makes it more difficult, certainly.
Yeah, but if you explain it a little bit to them that it's not, I don't know, but this scientist answered in the way that I thought I would. I might say it's impossible in the next 10 years, but I would certainly never say it's impossible in 200 years. And that's the attitudes, as I said. There was one other example. I can't remember the exact example, but the scientist said almost impossible. And then in the end said something that, was it some fruit fly or something had lived for this amount of time, because the interviewer said it was frozen and brought back, and he said, no, it's impossible to do it with animal organisms, blah, blah, blah. And then the person said, wasn't it just recent news that some fruit fly had been brought? Oh, yes, I didn't allow for that. Maybe it is possible. Because he was talking about living organisms can't be frozen and brought back, etc., or can't be suspended. I should use the term frozen because people use the term frozen. I say, well, people buy lamb calves brains or something, and they freeze them and then they eat them afterwards. They're still in reasonable shape. It's not like they become mush after that. But that's a different freezing, and I do understand that. But that's why you've got to be careful of using the terms properly.
Yeah. I just finished writing quite a long science chapter for my book on cryonics, and there is so much evidence out there that people probably don't have in their mind. So I try to put all together in a chapter that people can quote from. And I think we need some websites that summarize that very clearly. So, because if you have to do all that research, you won't be able to answer someone in time. But if you have that in your mind, there was this with the rat hippocampus, and there was this and this, it makes it very hard for scientists to say, oh, it's totally science fiction, when you can show that we're already cryopreserving, reversibly cryopreserving all kinds of tissues and cells, and even beginning to do organs. It makes them look rather foolish if they then say, well, it's impossible. We'll do brains. We may be able to do rabbit kidneys, but never human brains. Why?
That's right. Yes, everything is impossible until you actually achieve it. Then the next step, it's like AI. This was impossible. The next step, it becomes possible. Oh no, that's not general intelligence. Now general intelligence is defined this way. You achieve that. Oh no. Wait a minute. It now is defined that way, etc. Right. So, but one thing that you're saying though, I don't think the scientific arguments against now are winning. The argument basically that I'm hearing is that just about everybody I've been interviewed with, everybody I talk to, and I'm talking Australia at the moment, doesn't think it's impossible. They think it's possible. That's not the thing that gets them over. But the attitude that I mentioned before, great idea, may be possible, but not for me. That's the piece that I'm thinking is I don't know whether you've ever sold cryonics to people. I have hardly ever sold it to anybody. It seems to be a group of people that 99.99% of the population will say something, maybe not that amount, but will say something, what I just said before. It's possible, I agree with it, but not for me. And then there's 0.1% of the population that says, yes, it's for me. I agree it's possible and it's for me. Everybody that I've ever talked to with cryonics is actually, I've never had to do a selling argument to them to say, all our members, all these, I've never had to sell it to them. Basically, they've come to me and they've said they believe it's possible and it's for them. That's why they want to join. When I talk to people who sell it to them, they say, I believe it's possible. You don't have to convince me of that, but it's not for me. I don't believe it's for me. That seems to be the major part of in Australia. I'm talking Australia from what I've heard, because no, sorry. Can I just add one more to that?
Yeah.
When I get interviewed, I always ask the people who interview me because they talk about how great it is, how possible it is, how, they agree with me. I say, well, would you do it? Well, yes, but it's not really for me. That's the standard answer. That's it.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Then
go
you have
on.
to ask, well, why is it not for you? What exactly is it that you're worried about? Are you thinking the future is going to be a bad place, or that you won't know what to do, or that the robots will be in control? What exactly is the reason it's not for you?
Here's the reasons. I can even tell you some of that too, because I do ask the people. Most people, if they're women, if they're women, because most of the women will answer, I won't know anybody at that time. That'll be the standard answer. The relationships that I have are very important to me. I don't know anybody. In the back of everything is the idea also that people don't really want to live very long lives. Even though I know theoretically they do, people don't really. They want to live in their minds, they want to live about the normal lifespan. I watched this thing once with Aubrey de Grey. He talked to an audience and he was getting interviewed, and the interviewer said to the audience, who were really intelligent, about 300 or 400 people, it's on YouTube. He says, how many people want to live really long lives? I think out of the 300, maybe 5 people put their hands up. And that's about the percentage. So of those long lives, you then have to pick the cryonics group who want to jump 200 years and live a long life. Is smaller. So basically, most people don't want to live long lives. Most of the women normally say female. That's why the female population in cryonics is so small, is they won't know the relationships part of it, and that adds to it. But the important thing is they have nothing against it, in the sense of, if you wanted to do it, fine, we're happy to do it.
When someone says they don't want to live longer, one thing I like to ask them as well, if they say, well, because I think my life would be meaningless, or some kind of thing like that, say, well, what about if you live 20 years shorter? Would that be better? Would that increase the meaning of your life? And then they start to think, well, why is 70 or 80 years special? Why? Because obviously people lived a lot shorter in the past, and we seem to be quite happy living to 70 or 80 today, as long as it's in good health. And I think that's one of the problems. They don't imagine being in good health. They imagine old age as being old age rather than extended vitality.
I agree. I agree with that. I've said, when my father passed away about 30 years ago, he passed away at the average age, which was about, for a man in Australia, was about 72 at that time. Now it's close to about 82. I said, well, we're 72 30 years ago. Does that mean at about 72 we just kill everybody off? Since nobody wants to really live past the normal age bracket, then why? But obviously I'm joking, but the thing about it is that people don't think about it in those terms. The other way Aubrey de Grey changed it around was, he said, all right, let me pose the question differently. How many people want to die from dementia? He basically said all the diseases that you're dying from, heart attacks and things, and nobody put their hands up, which basically means all these people really want to live longer. Most people imagine their life to be something like this, and I'm stressing, but they imagine that they live the normal lifespan. Then one day they go to sleep and they don't wake up. They live reasonably healthy up to some normal lifespan, and then they just go to sleep. And that does happen sometimes, but it's not the normal case. Normal case is hospitals, diseases, etc., etc. And if you could eliminate those, then that's great too. But anyway, side issue.
Actually, that leads me to, I know we're running out of time, but that leads me to another question I hadn't really thought of. What are the laws in Australia for death with dignity, assisted suicide, or whatever you want to call it, depending on the details? Because obviously that can make things a lot easier for cryonics organizations, because someone can schedule their cryopreservation. You have a team there, no problems. Is that something that's available or likely to be?
It's available, not in the state I'm in. It's available in a state. In some states it's available, some states it's not. and they're very different rules against how it's available. Normally, it needs something where the disease you have is a very, what can I call it? One where where you have almost zero chance of survival over a period of time.
Yeah.
Excuse me. We have somebody,
Terminal. Yeah.
yeah, very terminal though. I
Yeah.
mean, within a very short time period, and normally it needs group doctors to sign off on it, or it's not voluntary. None of this is voluntary in any of the states in Australia, but they do offer it. But again, it's very special cases. You would have to
Mm.
be really a special case with a whole lot of doctors signing off on
Mm.
it.
That's a little surprising, given that you said the lack of religious belief in Australia. I'm kind of surprised it's not more open to that.
it's
Even in the
and
US, many states are now having laws like that.
yes. Well, in
Mm.
Australia, in fact, when they do the polls and that of the population, most people are for assisted dying.
Mm.
But I guess the politicians are still too locked into their own way of thinking and thinking that this is not a real vote getter and won't be something. It could be a vote loser because of some effect on it. But it is available, but not available as freely as say Switzerland, for example. It's
Mm.
not like a Swiss case. Uh, there is a difference though. In Switzerland, apparently the coroner gets involved when even though you do that, which means an autopsy is possible. Whereas in the
Mm.
Victorian case, the coroner does not get involved. The other
Mm.
state that I mentioned in Australia, but that's if you have a very serious illness.
That's that's bizarre, though. I mean, if you've been in hospital and you've been tracked all that time, why would the coroner need to do anything?
Oh, that's in Switzerland, but in Switzerland it's voluntary. You see,
Yeah.
assisted suicide. So in Switzerland, they've got to be
Oh,
careful.
okay, in those kind of cases, okay,
Yeah,
not one where you've been, you're
yeah.
terminal for a long time.
But
I
it
see.
can be a
Yeah.
problem. Emil was telling me it can be a real problem because they could
Mm.
end up with an autopsy for somebody who did an assisted suicide to end up being suspended. So
All right.
he's got that problem as well.
Yeah,
Uh,
you'd have to provide a lot of medical records and medical history to
yeah,
explain,
yeah,
why
that's
you want to
right.
do this,
Yeah.
that you're in
Now,
chronic
in
pain and
Australia, as
so
I
on.
said, it's not in the state I'm thinking of. It's not necessary. I don't know every other state. Every state has its own rules in that area. Our state does not have it. The state I am in, the state the facility is in New South Wales. Sydney does not have that assisted suicide.
Well, just to finish off, can you tell me a little bit about the procedures and protocols you use? Are they similar to any of the US organizations? Do you use vitrification, for instance, or a
Yeah.
different kind of cryoprotection? And
No,
how does it
we
work?
use we use very much. We leveraged on and borrowed from our friends in the US, both CI and Alcor. Now we use the CI VM1 solution.
Mm.
In fact, they make it for us, and I ship it over. It's actually making it in the US and shipping it over is cheaper at the moment than making it in Australia. Just to show you how expensive things can be here. But they make it, and we ship it over here. We use um, the protocols we had. Aaron Drake. He he came over, or actually he did it. He did come over, but we also did a extensive YouTube type videos where he did training of that group Australian Blood Management to do the standby, and we had.
Mm.
And they bought. He suggested you need all this equipment, so we bought all that equipment. These were the points at which you do this. This is the point. So we're pretty well uses the protocols that he laid out for us, that he himself uses for his own organization. So that's where we borrowed that part. And then for the actual cooling down process at the facility itself, we have a cooling chamber which we got from our Chinese friends. We bought
Mm.
their one, which is that very, with all the rods and all the things.
Yeah,
And you
several
got,
injections of liquid
yeah,
nitrogen.
you
Yeah.
can do this and you can do that. And we
Mm.
use that and it worked very well. We had some problems with it initially, but again, they were very helpful
Mm.
in getting it all going properly. So that's what we use as the cooling. It's like a big coffin, a big stainless
Mm.
steel, gigantic, heavy thing that, but
Yeah,
it
I've
works.
seen them.
We
Yeah,
can
it's
put
huge.
the stuff in and we can plot the graphs. We can do how long it takes to get the patient down. We do it
Mm.
over, I think we used last time, we did it for a reason, but I think we used, can't remember, 24 to 48 hours. I can't remember what the graph was that we used to
Mm.
get the patient down from dry ice to liquid nitrogen type temperatures.
And are you doing case reports, case reports,
Yes,
and
we
CT
do.
scans on
And,
patients?
yeah, no CT scans. We don't have the ability to do CT scans, but we're doing case reports. We did case reports for the first patient, and I've promised a few people, I think yourself included, to get it to send it to you to have a look at it. We'd love it to be critiqued. I mean, it's our first patient. We think it went all okay, but it'd be good for the next patient to critique it and find out what we may and can do better next time round.
Well,
I've got most of the pieces to it. I just need one couple more pieces before I
okay.
send it over for you.
Well, we have a lot of expertise at Biostasis Technologies, a lot of people who know the protocols, including Aaron Drake, who's now working with us as well. So we'd be happy to give feedback on that.
Oh, great. Yeah, look, I'd be great to be able to do that. That patient worked for us very well, but one of the reasons was everything was in close proximity. The facility, well, not the facility, that wasn't critical, but the people that do the SST, the funeral home, they were all and the hospital were all within about half an hour of each other.
Oh,
so we got to do everything very quickly. We were sort of lucky that being our first patient, because things that could have gone wrong actually went right. Even getting dry ice, which I've now found is more difficult than what you think it might be, it was actually easy. We had a very helpful group of people. We didn't go to a main company. We went to a smaller company, which helped us out a lot more than what a major company sets their rules. A smaller company sets agreed to rules between the two of us. So that worked very well. So the whole thing for us went very well. Australian Blood Management spent about 8 to 10 hours with the patient from the time they got him at the hospital bed to the time we worked on him to get them in the end to dry ice type perfusion, dry ice temperature and that. So, but again, I do need to send that the case report for some critiquing, because I think we would benefit from it.
Yeah, definitely. It's very good. Feedback is really critical in this area because the patients can't ask for it themselves. So, yes.
I agree. We're not, as I said, we're like most organizations. We don't want to hide anything, because if we hide something, we don't gain the next time around by doing that. We want to be.
And you're going to be cryopreserved eventually too, so you want it to go as well as possible. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to add before we conclude?
No, I think we covered quite a bit. Probably talked too much through most of it, but we covered quite a bit. That's pretty good. It was interesting chat. Well,
it's been a pleasure talking with you, Peter, and I hope to see you again soon. You should come over for one of the Cryonics conferences that seem to be happening every year these days.
I'm going to try for the next one too. It was very good, the last one we had that I attended there in Florida, and looking forward to the next one too. Okay. Looking forward to seeing you and everybody all again.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Peter, and best wishes for the future. I hope everything goes fantastically well.
Thank you. Okay.